The following production contains a series of slides compiled for your interest by the Blidworth and District Historical and Heritage Society. This presentation is taken from Blidworth in Old Picture Postcards, one of a series of books written by Blidworth author Will Richards. The book begins with an introduction written by the author and goes as follows. The following pages do not follow any ordered sequence of events or ideas, but are simply bits of history, scraps of information about our old village of Blidworth, the ways and customs of our village folk, the things I have heard, have observed and have experienced. These have been jotted down in spare moments, and if they appear to be a mixed medley, and perhaps of little interest to many, yet there will be some who will deign to dip into its pages and be transported into an age long past. If so, I shall be doubly pleased, for it has not been a task, but a pleasure of recollection and recollection. The audio content of this presentation is taken, in the main, from text written by Will Richards that is attached to each page of his book. Will Richards sadly passed away in 2013, aged 97 years. He remained active until the end of his life, researching and compiling details of former times of our district, and for his efforts we shall be eternally grateful. The Reverend Richard Whitworth is pictured here standing in St Mary's churchyard in the year 1890. He was the Vicar of Blidworth from 1865 until 1908. He was a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Vice President of the Nottinghamshire Thoroton Society. Sam Clark, a Blidworth boot and shoemaker of the time, wrote, "Mr. Whitworth was an Oxford M.A., a scholar and a gentleman, being very popular with his parishioners and very proud of the church and his parish. Although not Blidworth born, the Reverend Whitworth took such a keen interest in Blidworth history and its growth. There is a belief that Will Scarlett is buried in Blidworth churchyard, and this is supported by a manuscript in which one of the old chaplains of Newstead Priory describes the visit of the Bishop of Hereford to Blidworth. The edifice of stone seen here on the footpath is said to be Will's memorial, and is made from remnants of stone left over from an ancient rebuild of the church tower. The vicar at St Mary's Church, Blidworth, in the year 1920 was the Reverend J.T. Paddison, and he is pictured here on the right with the choir, the organist, the organ blower and the sexton. On the vicar's right in the picture is John Birch, who was the sexton of St Mary's for most of his life. The processional cross kept near the choir stalls was commemorated to his memory. Mr. Paddison planned to marry a Blidworth girl, and he arranged to establish a life for them both in Australia. The girl eventually travelled to join him in Australia, where they were to be married. Soon after arrival, the girl was reported as being homesick, and she soon came back to Blidworth. Very early in the year, as can be seen here, snowdrops would appear along the bottom of the wall of the church, and later on primroses grew amongst the headstones on the other side of the path. The tower of the old Blidworth windmill still stands, and it can be seen from the road near the church gate. Old folk can remember it working and producing flour. On clear days, Lincoln Cathedral is visible from the site. The millers were also bakers. Wheat flour was produced, but in wet harvest years the flour was unsound and would not rise in the oven. Apparently Frank Whitworth, Vicar Whitworth's son, could throw a cricket ball from the church gate and hit the rotating sails of the Tower Mill, a feat never known to be equalled. About 50 years ago, poultry would climb inside the steps to roost, owls would nest in the top, and pigeons also made it their home. There was also a post mill in Millcroft Field behind the old Wesleyan School, but this was pulled down in 1879, and marks made by the tail of the mill could still be seen years afterwards. On the right of the picture stands the New Inn, and opposite the New Inn stands the gateposts of St Mary's Church. The stone lintel above the church gates had an inscription as follows: "Enter unto his courts with praise." But when the sandstone became eroded, a wooden board was fastened over it, slightly amended, and said, "Enter unto his courts with praise." The inscription on the inside of the gates, to be read as you left the church, was, "Go and sin no more." The man on the left is looking into Carville's shop window. The display was usually sweets, brushes, black lead for the fire rangers, and many other things. At the end of the grassy roadside near the New Inn was the entrance to the mill yard. Inside the yard was a mounting block that enabled riders to fasten their mounts whilst visiting the public house or the church or both. The very first Blidworth post office was on Beck Lane, close to where the War Memorial is now. The first telegraph was installed in Blidworth post office on the 28th of June 1899. This post office was kept by the Harris family, and one of the sons was later postmaster of the post office on Main Street and later the post office on Mansfield Road. The postman in uniform delivered the letters that were posted in Mansfield. He walked by way of Littleworth, Berry Hill, Lyndhurst and Fountaindale before finally reaching Blidworth. In the yard behind Grove Farm was a hut in which he rested until it was time to collect the afternoon mail, as he walked back towards Mansfield, collecting mail along the way. He had 2 pairs of boots, which he wore on alternate days, and these were made and repaired by Sam Clark, Blidworth's bootmaker. On the opposite side of the lane from the post office was the pinfold, surrounded by a stone wall, part of which still stands. Any cattle found straying in the parish were kept in the pinfold. Surgery Lane, so called because until the early 1920s a doctor's surgery was held once a week in a room in the bottom house of the lane. Dr. Sanders of Hucknall would make the journey to Blidworth in his horse and trap. He wore a deerstalker hat, cape, loud clothes and leggings, and he carried instruments and pills in his Gladstone bag. Purgatives and cough cures were kept on view in the surgery in large bottles. The village lock-up, called the Roundhouse because it was a small dome-topped building, once stood on the land in front of the well. The parish constable, an unpaid official elected annually during the church vestry meetings, had the duty of putting drunks and rowdies in the roundhouse for the night, after providing straw for them to lie on. The building was pulled down in 1867. One of the postmaster's sons was an invalid for a long time, and Jack Kemp, the blacksmith, was commissioned to build an invalid carriage which could be pulled by a donkey. As mentioned earlier, Len Harris, who was the invalid's brother and is shown here wearing the watch chain, was later himself postmaster at both the Main Street and Mansfield Road post offices. The burly man at the front was Jack Kemp in his Sunday best clothes. The donkey belonged to Bill Hallam, who used it and the cart to take him to his workplace. Another man shown here is Bill Hallam, who also suffered permanent lameness. Bill received a pittance for breaking stones with which the roads were repaired. Farmers collected large stones from the fields and delivered them to Bill and his workmate Chippy Godfrey at some point in the road where they were working. The large stones were smashed with a hammer and then passed through a mesh before they qualified as suitable for road fill. This would be the scene on Main Street just after the turn of the century. There was no mains drainage and water can be seen running in the gutters at the side of the road. Some of the water ran down Marriott Lane into a pond in the meadows which acted as a soakaway, and when that pond overflowed the water ran into another pond at the lower end of what is now Meadow Road. Sam Clark, the village bootmaker, lived in the house on the right, and the low building on the edge of the picture was the wash house and privy. On the other side of the road is Knowles' General Shop. The high chimneys of the Red Lion are on the right. The man walking down the middle of the street is John Collins, the registrar and insurance agent, who, like Joseph Whittaker, always walked on the road and never on the pavement. This is how Clifty Nook looked about the year 1908. Some years earlier, this part of the village was called St Margaret's Gate, as all the strategic entrances to the village were gated, and a man was appointed to see that all the gates were closed and barred at sundown. There is no sign of Hawthorn Terrace, nor yet of the lovely red hawthorn trees that were once on the right-hand side of the road. There are no street lamps, and the downstairs windows are all shuttered. As scarcely any light was shed onto the road, folk who had to make a journey often carried a lantern. The leafless trees show that this picture was taken during one of the colder months of the year, and yet no smoke is showing from the chimneys. The nearest working colliery at that time was at Linby, and men would walk there by way of Kig Hill and Papelwick. Carriers would bring coal to Blidworth from the Langton and Linby collieries. The proceedings at the Blidworth church rocking ceremony in 1924 were unprecedented. Custom required that the baby chosen to be rocked before the altar in the centuries-old cradle should be the most recently baptized baby boy. John Birch was the church sexton and gravedigger, and when his wife gave birth to twin boys, a few weeks before Rocking Sunday, the vicar decided that the twins should be rocked. However, a baby boy was born to another couple soon after the twins were born. The parents of this baby protested that their child should be the one to be rocked, so the vicar decided to rock all three babies. The twins' mother was too ill to attend the ceremony, and the picture shows John Birch's mother holding one of the twins, while the vicar, the Reverend John Lowndes, holds the baby whose parents are standing on the right. Coal gas pipes were first laid in Blidworth shortly before the First World War, and pictured here is part of the gang of local men recruited to dig the trenches into which the pipes were laid. On the left is Henry Pratt Brown, who was held in affection by everyone who knew him. Next is Tommy Clay, a relative, though not a descendant, of Matthew Clay, who left an account of his experiences before, during and after the Battle of Waterloo, in which he took part. The watch chain is worn by the foreman, sent by the Southwell Gas Company to oversee the work. And on the right is Jack Watson from Blidworth Bottoms. The Blidworth Wesleyan Band of Hope Minute Book contains this item, dated November 22nd, 1922. As there seems to be no prospect of having gas in the school, seeing as how the Southwell Gas Company required £25 for putting it in, and there being no money in the school trust fund, a cylinder of liquid acetylene is to be purchased for use with the magic lantern. In this picture of Blidworth Bottoms, the building seen end on is the Fox and Hounds. White's General Shop is in the middle of the picture. The hamlet had several small cottages similar to the ones shown, all within a radius of a few hundred yards. Useful gardens were attached, poultry and often a pig was kept. A man called Fish Jack from Bulwell toured Blidworth on Friday afternoons, selling fish and fruit from a horse barrow. He stabled his horse and himself for the night at the Bird in Hand. Then he would go through the village again, before making his way back to Bulwell through Blidworth Bottoms. The area was teeming with game at that time, and Bottoms men ensured that fur and feather were part of his returning cargo. Mr. Joseph Whittaker lived for most of his life at Rainworth Lodge, and he died there on the 27th of May 1932. During his life, he was well known as an authority on many forms of animal life, and particularly on British birds. Besides his naturalist studies, in the course of which he became a Fellow of the Zoological Society and Vice President of the Selborne Society, Mr. Whittaker was a collector of china, bric-a-brac, books, prints and other curios. For many years he retained the first circular saw ever made, a Mansfield product. On the 10th of October 1906, on the Berry Hill estate in Mansfield, Mr. Whittaker was one of a party of 7 that recorded the largest count for any shooting party in Nottinghamshire, and that included 1,504 partridges. To commemorate the celebrated writer and naturalist Gilbert White, a memorial window in Selborne Church in Hampshire was commissioned by Mr. Whittaker. There was once cavernous cellars under the properties behind the stone wall on the left, with steps leading from them into the houses. Arms were stored in these cellars during the time that Napoleon threatened invasion. William Hopkinson, who was 21 years old at the time and who lived to be 98, said, "Sometimes regulars used to visit. This meant that serving soldiers gave advice to Blidworth's equivalent of the Home Guard of the day. It is claimed that Maid Marian lived on this site over the cellars. In the centre of the picture, the chapel is seen as it looked from 1837 until 1932. The light-coloured buildings in the chapel yard were used to store iron for the blacksmith, linseed cake for the cattle, chains, rakes, scythes, and many other implements. During the period 1870 to 1925, the shop on the right with the board over its door was used for business by Brodie's, Springthorpe's, and the Kirkby and Ashfield Cooperative Society. Merryweather's general store and shop was on the opposite side of the adjoining entrance yard. This motor charabanc was the vehicle that began a regular service between Mansfield and Blidworth via Rainworth. It was operated by Davis and Hope from a garage near the railway bridge on Southwell Road near Mansfield. This picture was taken at Matlock. It shows the driver, Jim Davis, leaning on the vehicle and the charabanc full of Blidworth folk on a day's outing. The object protruding from the back end is a folding tarpaulin sheet that was stretched over the top of the passengers in bad weather. The hinges on the several side doors can be seen, and also a headlamp with its acetylene gas container. The tyres were of solid rubber. Folk in this picture, taken in 1920, who still have descendants living in the village are Mrs. Bennett, Mrs. Booth, 3 generations of the Hewlett family, Fosters, Mrs. Bourne, Mrs. Harpham, Frank's girls and Mrs. Baxter, and of course Charlotte Marshall, who went everywhere. Children walking home from school towards Fishpool and beyond. Claybank cottages are on the left, and on the roadside banking was Clay Pond. This pond was created around 1860 and was made by the removal of clay for making building bricks for the village. In the springtime, children collected frog spawn from the pond, kept it in jam jars and placed them on the school windowsill so that the spawn could be seen developing into frogs. Harry Grass lived for many years in the cottage nearest the church at the bottom of the hill. He was the rabbit catcher on the Haywood Oaks part of Sherwood Lodge estate, and was a familiar figure as he strode through the village with dogs at heel, staff in hand, and satchel on his back. On the skyline is the gable end of 2 of the cottages on Rickett Lane, which have since been demolished. A well head, which once stood outside the cottages, was placed on exhibition in the grounds of Nottingham Castle, but has since been returned to Blidworth and now stands at the top of Surgery Lane. During the Ice Age, glacial deposits were left in Blidworth parish. This one stands in a field a few hundred yards west of the church and is known locally as Rock Close. Some of the deposits were removed to aid cultivation, but the largest of these has been left unmolested. Called colloquially the Rock, it is shown on maps as the Druid's Stone, and because of its size and shape, it is thought that the Druids used it. 14 feet high and with a flattish top, it would be ideal for the rites practiced by the Druids. Perhaps the most interesting feature is the natural hole through the middle at ground level. In more recent times, children were passed through this hole to cure whooping cough. The public footpath running past the rock came to a wood in which a family had excavated a dwelling dug out of the earth and roofed it with branches and straw. A few do-gooders complained to the authorities, but the health inspector officially reported that he had never seen a more healthy family. Taken soon after the first council houses were built in Blidworth. Except for the lone house opposite Bellevue Lane, there was no other building on Mansfield Road. Near where the men are standing in the road was a stile in the hedge and a footpath that led diagonally across the field, behind the trees and onto Bellevue Lane. After crossing the lane, the path led past Thorney Abbey Farm to Rainworth railway station, from where a train could be boarded when travelling to Mansfield. There was no bus service to Blidworth until the mid-1920s. The gas lamp on the corner was the only illumination for Dale Lane. Anyone walking on the stretch of road disappearing over the hill towards Mansfield was said to be going up Brickins, because clay was collected there. The clay was then moulded into bricks, and the bricks were kilned in the field on the right just over the hill. These bricks were used to build much of Old Blidworth. The blacksmith's workshop. Charles Simpson, the waistcoated figure behind the grindstone, owned the business and lived at the house in the top of the steps. Wearing the leather apron is Jack Kemp, who was immensely strong as well as being a skilled craftsman. There were 2 anvils in the workshop with furnaces and bellows, and enough space for 2 horses to be shod at the same time. There was a manually operated metal drill, as well as quenching troughs and racks for special tools. To the right of the shop door was an iron bending device which shaped the flat lengths of iron into large circles to be used as tyres on the cart wheels. Tom Clark, the village wheelwright, had his business just over the road, where he made the wooden wheels, and these were laid down just to the left of the blacksmith's workshop door and made fast, ready to be fitted with tyres, and these tyres were hammered on red hot. Water was then poured on to shrink the iron and swell the wood. As speed was important, passers-by and boys often helped in this operation. This was a shop at Blidworth Bottoms. The first proprietor in the early part of the last century was Mrs. White, and the picture shows Mrs. White's daughter, Gertie, and her son, Billy, holding the dogs. Many cottagers kept dogs such as these, because they would bark at strangers and because wild rabbits were plentiful. Note the heavy window shutters. The Kirkby and Ashfield Cooperative Society supplied goods to several businesses, including Blidworth Bottoms, by using their store's motor. If residents ordered goods on Thursday at the shop, the goods were delivered for collection by Saturday morning. Their delivery route was lengthy and always on time. First calls were at Hayward Oaks, then at Salterford, Sansom's Wood and Tithe Farm before arriving at Blidworth Bottoms. Then via Appleton Dale, the Lodge, the Waterworks and Longdale to Blidworth Dale, from where an old coach road led to Bottoms Farm. Almost the whole route was through the Seeley estate, where full-time gatekeepers were employed to ensure that a large number of pheasants and partridges were always available for the return journey. At one time, the edifice known as St. Lawrence's Chantry was on the southern boundary of the churchyard, but the hallowed ground has been extended during the last 50 years. The Reverend Whitworth wrote in the Mansfield Advertiser in 1904, "Considerable pleasure has been given in this forest village by the restoration within sacred grounds of the remains of 2 churches, more ancient than the present. They are simple, interesting, and suggestive. It is remarkable that the windowsills of the latter of the two are cut from incised and rather elaborate slab crosses made from an older structure. The late Mrs. Need, mother of Sir Arthur Need, rescued the stones from a destructive fate. It has been impossible to follow any particular design on the reconstruction, but the fruitful and accommodating resource of Mr. G. Wells of Cornton has produced a structure that has created an interest beyond our extended parish. This was the view looking south along Mansfield Road towards the Forest Folk corner. The wooden fence on the bend is where Dale Lane eventually begins. The small tree behind the white fence is the Jubilee oak, planted to commemorate Queen Victoria's Jubilee. When land was needed at the junction to build the Forest Folk Hotel, the tree was removed and unsuccessfully transplanted into the gardens of Rainworth Lodge. The wooden fence had a strange mark on it, said to be made by the teeth of a man who was killed when he crashed into the fence on his bicycle after failing to negotiate the bend. The wooded area in the distance was called Rookwood. The public had access to Rookwood, and folk will remember enjoying a most pleasurable walk through there. Later, there were allotment gardens near the two tall trees on the skyline. The line of cottages is still called Clifty Nook. Thomas Cresswell Godfrey lived in the end cottage. He was known as Tom Cress, because the fashion of the times was to call folk by their Christian names, and very few knew that his surname was Godfrey. Although the photograph describes this as rock cottages, this row of houses is actually called Rock Terrace. The rock or Druid stone, which is quite close by, was probably the reason for the choice of name. Rock Terrace should not be confused with Rock Side. Rock Side was one large building which had been subdivided many years ago to form two houses with gardens that fronted onto the top of Field Lane opposite the Laurels. Mr. Samuel Bogue and his family lived in one of the Rockside houses, and the Mrs. Wilson in the other. When Rockside was demolished, there was a stone over the door marked Richard Grammer and his wife Anne, 1676, but this was probably taken from another house that had been lived in by the Grammer family. There was a hand pump in the scullery of the Wilsons' house, and during building renovations in 1985, a well 114 feet deep was discovered. A stone on the top of the well had the date 29th of June 1813 carved on it. Richard Grammer was the head gamekeeper of Blidworth Wood and served the Archbishop of York. Here we see a strange-shaped building at Rainworth, known as the Ink Pot, and this was originally a toll bar, serving the route between Newark and Mansfield. For some years a toll had been levied for using this road, now known as Southwell Road East. In 1824, a 10-ton weighing machine was installed, and the amount of the toll charge was dependent upon the weight of the vehicle and its contents. In 1867, the weighing machine was sold for £12, but the toll house remained occupied for nearly a century as a family residence. When it was finally demolished, the stones were used to repair the Nottinghamshire County Police Headquarters at Epperstone. Rainworth's historic elm tree can be seen at the road junction with the Robin Hood Public House behind it. Slaney's Stone is about 18 inches high and can still be found beside Chapel Lane in Ravenshead, about 150 yards north of the Sherwood Ranger Public House, although its original site was lower down the valley. Mr. John Slaney lived at the farm known at the time as Canary Island, where the Longdale Craft Centre once stood, and he sometimes used his horse and cart to travel to the Little John. And the story goes that on the night of the 24th of January 1893, his horse and cart arrived back at the farm driverless, so his wife drove back to look for him, and she found him lying in the road. Helpers took him back to the pub, where he was found to be dead. At the inquest it was suggested that the horse knew its own way home without any assistance, and consequently John Slaney had drifted off to sleep, fallen from the cart and pitched headfirst into the lane. The Wesleyan Chapel, 1837 to 1932, was erected on the site of the first chapel, which was built in 1787. In 1843, a day school was started in the rooms at ground level under the chapel, and this continued until 1885, when a new school was built. Boot scrapers can be seen on either side of the main door. To the right of the chapel entrance is the chapel yard, and one of the 3 terraced houses which once stood there. At the top of the yard are the high chimneys from the school heating stoves. The arc-shaped stone wall in the middle of the road surrounded a trough, and this was a favourite spot where many people would gather and exchange gossip. Stone posts supported the ornamental gates. The chapel was the religious and social centre for its members. In addition to the Sunday services, members met once a week in class for mutual religious confidences and experience. Each class had a leader with ability and integrity, well versed in the scriptures and able to give wise counsel drawn from years of experience. Rainworth Lodge, where Joseph Whittaker made his home for the greater part of his life, was a veritable museum containing many rare specimens of bird and animal life. Almost the whole of the wall space was used to accommodate hundreds of cases of exhibits. These contain no fewer than 520 varieties of birds and 52 varieties of animals, amongst them being a white fox caught in Nottinghamshire, a white otter captured in Scotland, and 2 white hedgehogs. The deer park near the house was stocked with rare Japanese deer, and some of these extremely shy animals were tame enough to feed out of the owner's hand. On the 23rd of June 1883, Mr. Whittaker's gamekeeper, Albert Spinks, unknowingly shot a bird known as an Egyptian nightjar. At the time, this was the only occasion that this species had ever been recorded in England. Mr. Whittaker sent the dead bird to his taxidermist, and this Egyptian nightjar is retained in the Mansfield Museum. In 1842, the hayloft and harness room in the vicarage stables were used as schoolrooms. The curate, Martin Rowe, saw the need for a church school, and in 1846 a site was given and a school was built. The big room, as it was called, was nearest the road and was divided by a curtain so that two classes could be taught. At the back of the picture, the infants' room can be seen. The headmaster's house adjoined the baby room at the back. Before the council school was built in 1927, children from the new colliery village attended this church school, and this resulted in 5 teachers having to teach 240 children. From the bell in the tower, a chain descended into the big room, and the bell summoned children to assembly. Beneath the flat roof on the left were 2 rooms with pegs for hanging coats and a water bucket for washing hands. In the entrance porch to the big room was the foundation stone with its inscription, Laus Deo, meaning Praise be to God. In 1675, a Crown warrant authorised Blidworth's inhabitants to dig clay and to make 30,000 bricks. Thomas Frost built the first house from these bricks that had to be kilned in an oven locally, and until 1960 his house stood a few yards further back from the road behind a tailor's workshop on Main Street. On the house was a plate inscribed T.F. 1676. The clay was dug from 3 places, some from Claybank down Church Hill, some from the corner of the field on the opposite side of the bend going to Rainworth, and some on the left-hand side of the road just beyond where it forks towards Mansfield. Large holes caused by extraction of the clay formed into ponds, and the one in the picture was called Brick Kilns Pond. It was filled in about 1975, and the site is now a lawn in front of the old house. This shop and post office was between the Black Bull and the White Lion public houses. The post office business was carried on in the room behind the posting box. Eunice Clark, who helped in the office and the shop for many years and also delivered mail in the old village, stands here with one foot on the pavement. Behind her is Grace Shopland, who lived in one of the row of cottages behind this building. Holding the paper is Mrs. Harris, the postmaster's wife. In front of her is Mabel Chandler, who delivered letters in another part of the village. The building on the right was used as a garage for the motorcycle and sidecar used by Mr. Harris to fetch papers from Rainworth Station. Newspapers were sent by rail from Nottingham to Newark, and there they were put on the Mansfield train that arrived at Rainworth at 6 p.m. Few tradesmen had a monopoly in the village, and around the year 1900 there were 2 blacksmiths' shops within a stone's throw of each other. The picture shows the inside of the workshop, which was once behind the house on the bend opposite the chapel. Most workmen wore collarless flannel shirts, but, however hot the work, William Bean Froggatt of Fishpool always kept his shirt buttoned up to the neck. Blacksmiths had an apprentice usually called a striker, because he often had to strike the hot iron with a large hammer before it was finally fashioned by the blacksmith's 2-pound hammer, and the apprentice pictured here is Jack Lockington. The locals traded gossip or discussed the local news when visiting tradesmen's shops. The weekly Nottingham Journal was 5 pence a copy, and several families would contribute to buy a copy, and it was passed around to be read aloud by the best scholar in the family. Below Holly Tree Cottage on Main Street is the large house shown in the centre of this picture. For many years it was occupied by the headmaster of the Wesleyan School, and it was known as School House, although it was not actually trust property. In 1903 it was resolved that the headmaster's salary should be increased by £5 to a maximum of £60 per year, out of which he had to pay rent. Also in 1903, the school report says, "Diphtheria is in the schoolhouse, therefore do not stand around when sewage flows down Main Street." It is likely that what the school inspector saw was not foul sewage, but used water from sinks running down the open drain, because in the privies were midden pits, which were a type of cesspit. An aerial view of Fountaindale as it looked around 1925. For many years the house was owned and occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Tom Shipside, and the surrounding well-kept gardens were well known to local people because garden parties for deserving causes were often held there. Beyond the house the fish lake can be seen, one of the 3 lakes in the grounds fed by rain with water near its source. Beyond the lake part of the moat can be seen, and Friar Tuck is said to have lived on the ground enclosed by the moat. Friar Tuck's well is just downstream of the lowest of the 3 lakes. In the bottom left-hand corner of the picture is the old coach road, which ran from Black Scotch Lane, known as the Scottish Drovers Road, into the courtyard at the back of the house. The coach road on the left went to the ornamental gates near Bessie Shepherd's stone. During the 1926 strike, school children walked from Blidworth to be entertained to tea on the circular lawn. The row of cottages once known as Mount Pleasant were at one time the most easterly houses in Blidworth village. Natives of Blidworth can tell of characters who lived on Mount Pleasant. One was George Goodall, who came to the village as a foundling and was brought up by a family at Norwood Hill Farm. He himself became a farmer, then retired in old age to live in the end house on the left in Mount Pleasant. He kept hives of bees there, and he seemed to have a way with them. Ever ready with practical help as well as quiet advice, he was greatly respected. Jack Hayes was a jack of all trades, most often recognized by the box of ferrets on his back. He would volunteer to do anything from marking out the cricket pitch to mowing grass in the churchyard. He was a regular member of the team that visited farms, threshing corn, when Stock's steam engine, threshing drum, straw picker, chopper, chuffed through the village. It was a matter of pride that Jack should steer the engine at that time. Looking from the Black Bull up the street towards the horse trough that is seen where the pavement ends on the right-hand side of the road. The young lady's bicycle had cords on each side of the rear wheel, from the mudguard to the hub, to prevent the long dress being caught in the spokes of the wheel. Behind the cycle is the shop where Alf Longden cut men's hair and mended boots. Merryweather's general shop is in the centre of the picture, and at that time, this picture was taken around 1905, Springthorpe's shop was the next building on the main street. The telephone link to Blidworth had only recently been made. The poles supported only 2 lines. The beer at the Black Bull was not brewed on the premises. The complete sign read Shipston's Home Brewed Ales, and the beer was delivered by a gaudily painted dray pulled by 4 decorated shire horses. These houses stood opposite the White Lion. They are typical of other rows of houses in some Nottinghamshire villages built in the 18th century. Knitting frames were worked in the upstairs rooms, and Blidworth's last knitting frame was removed from the house in the far corner around the year 1900. In spite of the poor light from the small windows, folk worked long hours at the frames to supplement the low wages. The raw material for making hose was brought from Nottingham by carrier's cart, and the finished stockings were returned to Nottingham. The earth closets for all these houses were bunched together behind the building on the left. That building contained a lathe that was powered by the operator's foot. An inside door led into the joiner's and wheelwright's workshop. William Hopkinson, who died in 1888, aged 98, lived in one of the houses and could remember the time of the Battle of Waterloo. For more than 50 years he was responsible for paying the wages of all who worked in the woods for the Duke of Portland. Before the First World War, the post office was near the bottom of Beck Lane, and the signboard can be seen over the window. Harry Chantry, the village handyman, lived in the house behind the Stallion. Besides mending clocks, bikes, and nearly everything else, Harry was available to give men a periodical haircut or a shave. Pratt Brown told of an occasion when, as he opened the gate, he was surprised to see a man submerging the lower part of his face into the rainwater butt outside the door. When he enquired as to the reason, the man said, "You'll soon see if you have a shave." After being lathered, Pratt's face began to sting alarmingly, so he said, "What sort of soap are you using, Harry?" It transpired that Harry had made his own that day, and overdone the soda. This immaculately turned out stallion was regularly taken on a tour of the area for stud purposes. The groom came from a farm on the Seeley estate. The saddler's shop on the right, with the horse collars hanging on either side of the door, was run by the Maxfield brothers, who lived in the white house on the left of the picture. The doorway on the extreme right of the picture led into an arched walkway that was the entrance to some caverns used for storage. Not only was the harnesses needed for farm horses, all the repairs to the harnesses of the ponies working at Rufford Pit were carried out at this workshop. The bottom half of the building between the White Lion and the saddler's shop was in use as a butcher's shop. As this picture was being taken, Tommy Whiteman is shown bringing his weekly meat delivery from Kirkby on his dray. The Red Lion, which flourished until around 1910, was between the butcher's and the saddler's shops. There was a water trough in the cellar of the good-looking house on the corner, and spring water ran through it. The driver of the pony and trap coming up Main Street was always Mrs. Henson of Robin Hood Terrace, Fishpool. The passenger was always her husband, Jim Henson, who worked in Rufford Pit Yard around 1920. Jim would rise at 4:30 a.m. to catch and feed the pony, and the journey to Rufford would be made in time to start work at 7 a.m. Mrs. Henson would then return to Fishpool to do the daily chores. She collected her husband at Rufford at 5:30 p.m. and was a familiar sight to Blidworth children as they came out of school. Leaning against the wall on the left is Alec, a well-known village character. Notice the gas lamp in the middle of the Black Bull Square. The paving stones on the right-hand side of the road had been worn concave by use over more than 2 centuries, and in winter-time children delighted in making it into a long slide. Opposite the end of Beck Lane was a row of houses called Menil Terrace. The shape of the bricks suggested that the houses were built in the 17th century. The houses were probably more accessible from the road at that time because that part of Main Street had its gradient altered so that the hill would not be so steep. Pictured are some of the zigzag steps, which were the means of access to the houses. Just out of the picture to the left were holes made in the sandstone by children's boots. Inside one of the houses, a very long winding staircase led to the bedrooms. On one occasion, when the occupant was ill in bed, 2 villagers were heard coming up the stairs to see the invalid, and one of them was heard to say, "I'll bet it's a job getting a coffin up these stairs." And on entering the bedroom, he marched straight over to the window to see if it was possible to get a coffin through there. What this did to the invalid's state of health is not recorded. Holly Tree Cottage, on the right of the picture, must have derived its name from the splendid holly tree at the gate. For about 70 years, the tree's distinctive shape was tailored by 2 of the occupiers, Neddy Godfrey and his son Percy. The trench running the length of this part of Main Street can be seen. Before the sewage pipes were laid in 1928, washing water from sinks and dolly tubs found its way into this trench, eventually losing itself down Dale Lane. It can be seen that there were cultivated fields before the Forest Folk Hotel and the colliery village were built in 1926. The wall on the left was built early in the 19th century, when a bend in the road was formed by cutting through the sandstone to make the hill less steep at that point. Grove House is on the left-hand side of this terraced row of houses. By the side of the doorway, which was reached down the steps through a little gate, was a brass plate that read, "John Collins, Insurance Agent and Registrar." Before the 1920s, Blidworth folk were required to register births and deaths at Mr. Collins's house, and this was not easy, as he was rather deaf. This, together with his impatience and proletariat attitude, sometimes led to mistakes being made. In the yard at the back of the house is a well more than 100 feet deep. Also in the yard is a flight of stone steps leading up to what was once a granary, but in the years around 1930 became a men's club room known as the Institute. In this club room was a 3/4 sized billiard table, skittles and other gaming tables. The house on the right was occupied by the Maxfield family, who worked the saddler's shop a few yards higher up the street. There is no sign of street lighting in this picture, therefore it was probably taken around 1902. Chapel Lane in Ravenshead was so named because the Fishpool Ebenezer Chapel was built there in 1864. When the chapel flourished, the evening service began at 6 p.m, and Mrs. Rose, who lived opposite the chapel, said, "You had to be there a quarter of an hour before, or you wouldn't get a seat." Folk attended in all weathers. The Band of Hope and Christian Endeavour meetings were held on weeknights, and young people from the district went regularly. At anniversary times and other special occasions, visitors from Kirkby and Mansfield came by horse break, and overflow meetings became necessary. On Good Friday there was always a special treat for children, and there had to be 3 sittings for tea. The building became disused in 1949, with the exception of lettings to the Ministry of Food for ration book distribution. A former Sunday school superintendent, Mr. Richard Clay, passed away and was buried at the bottom of the pulpit steps. This made it very difficult to obtain permission to sell the building. However, the body was later exhumed and reinterred in Blidworth churchyard. After the Black Bull water trough was demolished at the turn of the 20th century, a gas lamp was erected on the spot. Every few weeks Mr. Beardall from the Southwell Gas Company would visit. He would place his ladder against the lamp-post before climbing and winding up the time clock that turned on the gas, which then ignited the pilot light. The mantle which enhanced the light was made from starched muslin. The corrugated iron building on the left foreground was built soon after the First World War. Over the porch was written, "Blidworth Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Institute." Inside was a bar for soft drinks, a billiard table, table game facilities, and a stage at the far end. Once a month a whist drive and a dance would be held, and the entrance fee was 1 shilling. There would often be more than 24 whist tables occupied, and sometimes the first prize for men would be a bottle of whisky, valued at 12 and 6pence. A piano, a fiddle, and a drum provided the music for dancing. Looking along Rig Lane towards the Fox and Hounds, the Rookwood can be seen on the skyline, and the wood beyond Beck Lane on the far right. The dresses of the ladies suggest the year to be 1910. Sam Clark, the bootmaker, wrote nearly 20 years later, "The Bottoms, or Lower Blidworth, comprises many dilapidated old cottages, including a well-attended primitive Methodist chapel and a spacious, well-built inn, the Fox and Hounds, which at that time looked sadly out of place. The most common name there when I was a boy was Coleman, and there is a gravestone facing the vicarage lawn erected to one Timothy Coleman, blacksmith, with the usual epitaph to Vulcan's sons, "My tongs and hammer are reclined, my bellows now have lost their wind," and so on. Some of the cottages Mr. Clark wrote of are not shown in the picture. Some were demolished and others modernized. At one time there were allotment gardens in the field, bounded by the tall hedge to the left of the picture. Bottoms is now much smaller, but no less loved than the older hamlet, which had a strong community spirit. Thomas Leake's cross is very prominent in St. Mary's churchyard. Thomas was the verderer of Blidworth Forest in the latter part of the 16th century, and he lived at Langton Arbour near Blidworth Dale. The Reverend Whitworth wrote, "His habit was to walk about the forest armed and with his 2 trusty dogs." At the 4 crossroads under the shade of forest oaks at Hayward's Corner was a wayside public house called the Archers. The landlady there had a daughter who took a fancy to our Thomas, and she had a mother who didn't. Thomas Leake was at the Archer public house to celebrate Rocking's Day and to visit the daughter. Therefore, he was unarmed and unattended by his dogs. Noting his defenceless condition and seizing the opportunity, the landlady called on two young men, one of whom was Captain Salmon of Salterford. Hot words were spoken and harder blows were given, and they sprang upon the old man of 60, and he died fighting manfully on the 2nd of February 1598, Rocking Day, and this is in our Blidworth register. Inside the church behind the door is Thomas Leake's memorial tablet in rhyme, erected in 1608. Mr. Joseph Whittaker died on the 27th of May 1932. A funeral service was held in Blidworth Church, where he held the post of churchwarden for many years. After cremation, the casket containing the ashes was carried in procession through the deer park to an edifice which had been quickly built. This memorial can be seen in the background, and the casket was placed inside it. The man holding the casket with the undertaker was Cecil Franks, the general handyman at Rainworth Lodge, and who lived in the cottage on the road near the house. The Reverend John Lowndes, the then Vicar of Blidworth, is behind Cecil Franks. Holding the processional cross kept in Blidworth Church is George Milner. The other white-robed figure was one of the visiting clergy. We hope you enjoyed our presentation of Blidworth and District. We do enjoy sharing the history of our villagers, and please contact us at any time if you wish to know more. Alternatively, you can visit our website at www.blidworthhistoricalsociety.co.uk or contact us by email at blidworthhistory@virginmedia.com.